recording now. So go ahead, Augie.
Yeah, I mean, what Bill and Michael said, I would concur. Perhaps, Bill, I was being a little optimistic a few weeks ago when I said 30%. Maybe that's hope springs eternal. But, to Michael's point, we do have 50 different election systems for each state. And there's a lot of variance in regards to when votes get counted, how they get counted, what are the rules in each state. We do know that both candidates have already hired a significant amount of legal talent to challenge any and all kinds of irregularities. So unless the results are so overwhelming in favor of one side or the other, I agree with Bill and Michael. We're talking about days, if not weeks. And we can get into the various, if you will, statutory and constitutional deadlines. But it would not surprise me if we're talking about the end of November, where we're still waiting on a couple important swing states in regards to the Electoral College.
Yeah, and most of the students watching today aren't going to be able to remember 2000 election, but we had a bit of a delay there. So much of a delay in one of the states that couldn't get things counted properly that it went up to the Supreme Court, and really was running right up to the December deadline for certifying things at the state level and having the Electoral College go. So we will see if it plays out a little bit similarly. This one I've got Augie written down as the person who's going to kick us off, and I think I'll just go like this if you guys are nearing like over 5 minutes on an answer. So watch out for that. Normally we'd be holding this event on campus in one of our large lecture halls, but COVID-related concerns forced us to adapt. Just as so many other things have had to adapt over the past 18 months, and certainly the election is not going to be any exception. In what ways might COVID-19 exacerbate uncertainties about the election outcome in November?
Okay. So to a point that Michael just made and I reiterated, remember, we have 50 different state systems. And much like the response to COVID-19 as a pandemic, we have wide variance in regards to how the states responded. So to keep that in mind, first of all, you have to take into account state capacity issues. So for instance, in-person voting staff concerns. We're seeing this in a number of states to where they lack the necessary staff for the in-person voting, if you will, precincts or locations. We have an increase in mail and absentee ballot voting because many Americans don't want to go to a centralized location where COVID-19 may spread. So again, we're already seeing related issues in the states. We've seen it in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You got printing and mailing issues, receiving ballots, and these have all been issues in a number of states across the country. As Michael pointed out, counting the ballots will also be difficult. The decreased staff, but the higher volume of mail ballots. And by the way, in a number of states, they still hand count mailed or absentee ballots. So these are all state capacity issues affected by COVID-19. Then you're also talking about state laws and state constitutional issues. We saw this just this week here in Virginia in regards to the last day to register to vote, okay? When the computer system went down, okay, it forced the state to go ahead and consider, could we extend the registration day? And in some of those states, okay, you also have issues in regards to when you can send in your mail ballot. Michael mentioned just a few moments ago how in some states, your ballot has to be postmarked by Election Day. In other states, it has to be received by voting officials by election day. And Allie, you just mentioned counting issues. You would think that counting ballots at this point in our country's history would be an efficient, effective process. But as we've seen just in this millennium, 2000, 2004, and the 2016 presidential elections, counting votes can be extremely difficult in states. And that's even more so the case with COVID-19, because so many voters are voting in different ways than they have previously. The last, if you will, variable related to COVID-19 that I want to touch upon are the federal court issues, okay? To my count, as of this afternoon, there have been at least a dozen claims in federal courts concerning states attempting to make changes to address COVID-19 related election issues. These include the following: adding ballot boxes for mail ballots, giving voters extra time to mail ballots, adding voting sites for in-person balloting, okay? And those are just the three big ones so far. There's probably others that the other panelists could go ahead and mention. So far, the federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court, their responses could hardly be described as consistent. So what this may mean is that in some states, there will be greater latitude in allowing people to vote, where they vote, how they vote, do they have the necessary signatures or eyewitnesses, etc. Whereas in other states, it will be less latitude, less discretion. So if you're talking about COVID-19, COVID-19 is already taking a process that has had historical issues in this country. And I can't believe I'm saying this when we're, you know, a couple centuries into our existence, right? But you're already taking a process that has, if you will, issues. And now you're sticking a pandemic on top of it. And states in particular, perhaps have not responded as diligently as we would like to have had them respond.
Yeah, and you mentioned something in there too, Augie, which is that COVID-19 is a new way of voting for so many people. And even though mail-in voting has existed in some states, and even though absentee ballots have been used before, they've not been used as regularly as they're going to be, yeah. Which means that voters who are unfamiliar with all the rules, and people are not great at following instructions, we know that as faculty members, there's going to be a lot of people who, I don't know if self-suppression is the right word, because a lot of the time those rules are purposely difficult, but essentially are going to think that they voted and have their vote cast out, and that's going to create, I think, some uncertainty too, which brings us to a question about voter suppression. This one's a two-parter. I've got Dr. Kina on the first part and Dr. Parlberg on the second part. COVID might be new to us, but voter suppression is an old political trick. What sorts of voter suppression tactics are we seeing in 2020, and how might they exacerbate the uncertainty of the election? And then how do these sorts of tactics compare to the way other countries run elections successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah, that's a really, that's a good question. Well, there's a lot of new forms of voter suppression that I had never even considered before COVID-19. For example, in Texas, installing one ballot drop-off box per county is a head scratcher. You can think about the most populated counties in Texas have several million people, and then the least populated counties have a few thousand people. This has obvious impacts on equitable access to the ballot. But you're also just seeing a battle over every single small detail that, quite frankly, probably won't really matter a whole lot. The general rule that I like to use when evaluating voter suppression is if a politician might suspect that this could hurt their chances, they're likely to resist it. And in a two-party system like we have in the United States, every victory that the other party has is a defeat for my party. It's a zero-sum game. And so you see this in Trump's war against mail-in voting in some places, but not Florida, where he gets to mail his ballot. There's always this attempt to try to intuit whether this is going to hurt me or whether this is going to help me. And that's one of the fundamental problems of our two-party system is consensus sort of things in other countries, like let's get more people to vote, end up being very divisive and very polarizing issues in our country, because a win for them is a win for is a defeat for us. And so one of the things we've seen is just the battle over these specifics about where I can drop off my ballot, mail-in voting, making certain exceptions, extending timelines. All of these are being battled over in different states. We saw in California the phony drop-off boxes that the Republican Party in California constructed, which is pretty remarkable. At the end of the day, I don't know that these battles really matter all that much. If you want to vote, you're probably going to vote. The biggest thing that I see that's not any different than what we've seen in 2020 than in past years is the rigid rules that we see with absentee ballots. If you don't sign in the right place, or if you don't get a witness to sign in the right place, or if you forget to dot your I's or cross your T's, they end up rejecting the entire ballot. The only difference this year is that there's orders of magnitude more mail-in ballots than we've ever seen in years past. Not necessarily in other states like California, where they have with no excuse absentee ballots, but in places like Virginia and some of the eastern states where they're not as progressive in their access to the polls.
Yeah, so I can speak to this a little bit from a comparative international perspective. On one hand, I focus my research on transnational elections. So when people in, for example, people who are citizens of the Dominican Republic, live in the US, vote in elections in the Dominican Republic and vote usually by mail, but sometimes in person at consulates or embassies. What are some of the problems that come up with that? So many countries have been dealing with this for a long time, and the reality is there are a lot of problems. Some of the same things that we are worried about in terms of counting or having ballots nullified because people didn't put the ballot in the right envelope. That's something that we have seen in a lot of cases in a lot of other countries. So when we talk about suppression, I think it's important to understand that in a kind of nuanced way. So first of all, suppression is kind of the negative flip side to turnout, and you can talk about it in terms of a question of just how the voting systems are set up, kind of institutional systems, if they're just complicated or just hard for people to understand, or simply the first time they're doing it. There may not necessarily be a sinister motive, but just effectively, if it's hard to vote, it will, drive down turnout. And then there's the question of campaign strategy. Now, I personally believe that strategies focusing on turnout and, on the flip side of that, on suppression, are going to be increasingly high profile in the future, simply because what we're seeing, just fewer and fewer undecided voters, a lot fewer people who are in the middle with political polarization. Just parties are moving further away from each other. There are a lot fewer people who live in mixed areas. You see geographic sorting, where people just choose to live with fellow Republicans or fellow Democrats. And I think the campaigns are responding to this, and they're seeing it's not as good of a, it's not as worthwhile to devote resources to try to convincing the few people who remain who are undecided or possibly in the middle or convincible, and it's better to devote your resources to turning people out. And if you are a little bit sinister about it, you might want to devote your resources to try to suppressing the other side. Now, I've seen examples of this in other countries. I've worked as an electoral observer, an international electoral observer for the Organization of American States, and I've done election monitoring in El Salvador and in Colombia. And there are particular examples of these things. When I was in Colombia, just for example, they have They have special lines reserved for women and senior citizens. And I was interviewing the campaign strategist for the only one candidate who was running for city council in the town of Ibagué in Tolima. And I was asking them, well, what do you expect? Will there be problems? And they say, well, what the other candidates are going to do, they're going to put people in the women and seniors line and tell them to take a long time to vote, like take 20 minutes to vote, and that's going to slow things down. And then people who show up late in the day to vote, it's particularly women, because they're going to vote for our candidate, they won't do that. And I said, well, they won't get to vote. And I asked, well, how do you know that they're going to do that? And they say, oh, because we did the same thing last time when we were hired, when we were working for her opponent, and then she hired us to do interference on that. So, I mean, these are particular tricks. I'm not saying that's the kind of thing that will happen here. But I will say that the types of things to prevent that, they're not necessarily that effective. I mean, as international election observers, you're just sent there to like stand around and watch people vote. And the idea is you serve as a scarecrow, that just by seeing election observers around, people won't engage in any kind of shenanigans, vote buying or fraud or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, most fraud that happens, it happens before election day. It happens by, if it's outright fraud like bribery or vote buying, that stuff happens quietly, off in the corners. It's not going to happen, at the ballots. Maybe a parallel to this in the US would be, it's just like the rules that are set up that determine how people vote, determine how hard it is for people to register, or to or how non-intuitive it is to vote. These are all things that can drive down turnout. Does that count as suppression? I think it depends on how you see it. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Thanks. And that reminds me of conversations I've been having with friends around the country. Because the flip side of things that seem like they're suppression because it makes voting a bit more difficult, like the signature matching that exists in some states, not Virginia. Virginia's made everything very easy. And the reason we can do that is because Virginia did not just mail absentee ballots to everybody like some states have, but in conversations with those friends in other states where they did receive ballots, the flip side of thinking of some of these things as suppression is that they're supposed to prevent some of the corruption that Trump is talking about. So why can you mail out ballots to everybody in Washington State or New Jersey or District of Columbia? Because if you have something like signature matching, they'll return it. I have a friend whose wife in New Jersey got her ballot returned the other day, and a friend in Washington who has had their ballot returned in the past, and then they get to go and fix it. But so, there are these balances between making sure that the integrity of the vote cast is really the voter who it says it is, but also not making it so difficult, I think, that people get it wrong and have their votes cast out. The next question is going to be from Kelsey.
Awesome. Okay, so we're talking a lot about uncertainty tonight, but the polls seem to point to a pretty decisive Biden victory. In the last presidential election, every major poll had predicted Secretary Clinton to defeat Mr. Now President Trump. And on the big day, the nation was shocked to see the opposite play out. Do you believe that these polls are still a reliable way to gauge and predict the upcoming election? What, if anything, might the polls be missing or failing to capture in this race?
Great. And Dr. Wintersteek, that's for you.
Yes, this is a great question, and one I spend a lot of time talking to folks about. And so really I want to address this as a two-part question. And the first part is to dispel the myth that the polls were not reliable in 2016. This is simply not true. This is a result of the media narrative of the problem being with pollsters and not the problem being with the media. The problem in this case is a problem of the media. So let's start by talking about why the 2016 polls were accurate and why the media is to blame for the public's misunderstanding of what the polls actually said. So the first thing that you should know is that in 2016, the polls were as accurate on average as we have had in previous years. So it was not anywhere outside the normal that we expected to see. As we would expect, the national polls were better than the state polls in predicting the overall vote winner. But of course, as we know, we don't elect the president via popular vote. We elect the president via the Electoral College, which is a state level process. So we have this sort of disconnect where the media reports on what's going on in the national polls instead of really focusing in on what's going on in the key states and what's going on with that polling. I would also note that one thing that I've seen the media begin to do a little bit this year is to report the margin of error, but there's still a fundamental misunderstanding by the media of what the margin of error means. And so when you look at any poll, you know, we as Americans consume politics like we consume sports. Right. And we like to cheer on our team and boo the opposite team. And the media bolsters that by reporting the sample statistic. Biden is ahead of Donald Trump in XYZ state by this many points. Right. That doesn't take into account the fact that in every poll there is error. And this is because we don't sample populations or we're sampling from populations. And so what happens in 2016 is that the error turns out to be particularly important because Trump ends up narrowly winning a number of states that Clinton was narrowly ahead in the polling. Another thing that we should also note, though, is that probability theory is what is used to calculate margin of error. So when you see a margin of error on a poll that's somewhere around 5, maybe 6% at the state level, we should predict that the true level of error is probably closer to 12 or maybe even 14%. Okay, so when we take this into account, the 2016 polls were actually incredibly accurate. The only thing that the media really can hit on is that there was a pro-democratic bias in the sampling in 2016. What that doesn't then mention is that there was a pro-Republican bias in 2012 in the polling. So this is not outside the norm at all. What we should note for pollsters is it's really hard to predict which direction the polls are going to bias, Democrat or Republican. And it just so happened that it mattered a lot in 2016 because we're talking about a few thousand voters predicting the election outcome in a small number of states, right? I would recall that Trump wins about 80,000 votes in 2016 in key states, but Democrats waste 4 million votes on Clinton in the state of California. So these are fundamental disconnects. Let's now then talk a little bit about the 2020 election and what we're looking at here. Because I want to remind you of what these things look like. And so students, if you're tuning in, a lot of this data is from Real Clear Politics, and they have this fantastic tool where you can build your own map. So if you go to realclearpolitics.com, you can pull up this map. And what you're seeing here is the map of states looking specifically at these toss-up states. So the 187 electoral votes in these toss-up states are what are going to determine this race. And we see those Nevada, Arizona, Texas, and then all up along the East Coast and in the Midwest, we have these really important states. And so this is where the state of the race is right now, right? The polling is pretty clear. Joe Biden has solidified about 226 electoral votes. Donald Trump has solidified about 125 electoral votes. The question is what happens with those 187. All right. Oh, wrong keyboard. So what I've done here is I've taken this map and I've rekeyed it in if we look only at the sample statistic. That is how the media on average reports who's winning and who's losing. In this scenario, it appears as if Joe Biden has a commanding lead. That is that we would expect that he would take about 374, depending on the poll you're looking at, 375 electoral votes, leaving Donald Trump with 164 votes, electoral votes. This is fundamentally misleading, and this is a real flaw of the media and something that we should hold the media to account for. They're fundamentally misinforming the American public about the state of the race when they do not take error into consideration. So earlier today, I went ahead and I looked through all the polls, and I was generous, right? I used the margin of error associated with the most recent polls in these states, in the key battleground states. And the question is, where does the race really stand? And when we look at it this way, as of today, there are only 2 states where we have any inkling of a notion of who's actually quote unquote ahead. Now, remember earlier I mentioned that the error in these states is probably closer to 12 or 14%. So we're taking this with a grain of salt. But given the data from today, it looks like Texas will likely go for Donald Trump, and that Georgia could go for Joe Biden, right? The rest of the states are a mathematical tie. We do not know the true level of support being in favor of Donald Trump or Joe Biden in these states at this point. All right, so you're now saying, so what's the use of these polls? Well, I would point you to the New York Times, who also has a nice poll aggregator. But what I really like about the New York Times poll aggregator is that they show you this difference from 2016. And where I think that we have some evidence that Joe Biden has made great ground is the fact that across states, Joe Biden's support today is much larger than Hillary Clinton's support was at this time in the election, 20 days before the election in 2016. And this is particularly prescient when we look at deep red states. States like West Virginia, where Joe Biden has made inroads of 25 to 28%. So this is big shift or a big change from 2016. And so when the question asks, should we understand the polls as telling us that Joe Biden has a commanding lead? The answer is yes and no. He certainly made up ground from where Hillary Clinton was at this time in 2016. And yet those battleground states are still going to be a fight until the end. So keep checking the polls, but keeping in mind that there is error associated with it and that the media is not reporting the polling data as it should be reported.
Thanks. I actually read a couple good articles this week. One of them was in the New York Times today, I think it was, that was pointing out some reasons for Democrats who are reading these polls not to get overly excited and confident. The New York Times piece pointed out the registration gap that's been existing in terms of new voters that have been registered by Democrats and Republicans since 2016 and how that's a bit counterintuitive to what we're seeing in the polling. And another one was in the New Yorker magazine, and it was essentially reminding us that in 2018, polls predicted a Democratic governor in Ohio, and that didn't happen. That polls have recently predicted a Democratic governor in Iowa, that didn't happen. Predicted a Democratic senator that was up for re-election in 2018 too, that in Indiana that didn't happen. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about either of those things, because I thought they were just interesting points that I'm not sure how to reconcile with the narrative that Biden's still up by so much.
I mean, I think it's also important to note that as you move down ballot, so sub-presidential, the margin of error increases even more dramatically, right? So the margin of error in those races, when the reported margin of error is 5%, you're probably looking at closer to 9 or 10%, and the actual error is probably closer to 20%, right? And so there's a question of how useful that polling is for sub-presidential races. And I think it's important to remember that polling is really expensive. We could do more polling. We could get larger samples from these key state races, and that would decrease the margin of error. But you're also talking about spending thousands of dollars every single day to poll in these key battleground states. So these are decisions that pollsters have to make, and citizens should be skeptical, right? Skeptical citizens are much less likely to be taken for a ride. We have to understand these predictive mechanisms in their proper role, and they can point us in the right direction.
Great, thanks. Kelsey, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes. All right. So the next question is, in what ways does the Electoral College create some degree of uncertainty in our presidential elections? How likely is it that one candidate wins the Electoral College and therefore the presidency, while another candidate wins the popular vote, similar to 2000 and 2016?
Dr. Condit, do you want to answer this one?
Sure, I'll jump in. I actually think that Dr. Winnisik's charts tell us a lot, right? So what that whole conversation was about was electoral college votes. It was not about popular vote, right? And I don't know if it was, I guess it was also Dr. Winnisik who said in the 2016 election, the Democrats, I think your phrase was, wasted 4 million votes in California. I think that we are in a really different period in American political history because we have changed demographically in the country. And that demographic shift is of such a magnitude that now that the matchup between how the Electoral College plays out and how the popular vote plays out are literally not related to each other unless you have a massive turnout across the country and it evens itself out, right? If you have a massive turnout again in high populous states, you end up with the Electoral College imbalance. It's built into the math. When someone in Wyoming has, I think it's now 117 times the amount of electoral vote as, sorry, I now have a beagle, of course, who's objecting, sorry folks, to the Electoral College. Somebody take the dog out, please. There's no way to reconcile that, right? I mean, as the population continues to shift, we see the emptying out of the Midwest, and we see people moving into the cities, and the cities becoming, and those states then becoming overweighted with population. I think the Electoral College, through time, is going to continue to be more and more disconnected, often from the popular vote. And this time around, I don't think we can. I think we should not have any sense of security that there will be a relationship necessarily. Unless the Electoral College vote and the popular voters are overwhelmingly directed toward one candidate.
Right. Thanks. Dr. Kina, did you want to touch on this at all?
I think I agree completely with Professor Condit. I don't know if I'm anticipating a question about the intent behind the Electoral College.
Go for it.
But it's interesting to think about the enormous gap between the rationale for the Electoral College, which was a bunch of slave-holding white dudes who owned property. If they didn't own slaves, they're investing in slaves, trying to protect the wealthy's class from too much democracy. But one of the little silver linings around that dark cloud was they wanted to give the Electoral College some freedom to choose who they would want, some discretion. And so the whole point of the Electoral College was to protect the Constitution so that it would elect a person who would actually be the guardian of the Constitution, as opposed to a demagogue or a populist who would reference the public as a source of legitimacy. Of course, that all changes in the election of 1800. We have the real threat of a tie between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate. It's quickly averted with the passage of the 12th Amendment. And then by the time Andrew Jackson comes along, he's convinced non-property owning white men that they're entitled to elect the president. And so once states start allocating their electoral vote based on the popular vote of the state and a winner-take-all rule, then the Electoral College ceases to really function the way that it was intended to function. So today what we have is a relic of this past that was in some sense meant to preserve the wealth of the ruling class, the well-educated property-owning white men at the very top of the pyramid, but in other ways has been completely bastardized because of these rules that were changed in the 1800s to accommodate westward expansion and the new growth of non-property owning white men. In an ironic way, that it now functions today to preserve the interests of the people who bankroll the Republican Party by selecting candidates who often lose the popular vote twice now in the last 20 years. So when we have these conversations, one of the things I always hear from family members as well as from friends is that, but we can't change the popular vote. This has this very sacred, beautiful purpose, which is to protect us from too much democracy. That is really couldn't be further from the truth when you actually look at the historical context behind the Electoral College and how the Electoral College was changed over time. So that's one thing to consider when we're talking about reforming the Electoral College.
Can I just chime in, Alex? Also, I mean, to tail in on that, one of the other arguments is the flyover issue, right? Is the argument that if we eliminate the electoral college and go to the popular vote only, then candidates will only be going to major cities. You know, I'm born and bred in Idaho, and I can tell you with the electoral college, no presidential candidate ever goes to Idaho anyway, right? That's a misnomer. And also, you know, only about 20% of the nation's population actually lives in the top 17 cities in the country. We actually have a pretty diverse, spread out population. Yeah, they're going to go to major cities, but remember, when candidates go to major cities, they're still only seeing an audience, depending on what candidate is and what they're reporting, somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 people at any one time in that city. And while that does have an effect, and there's a media spillover of local media, et cetera, it is, we don't have any evidence that literally they will stop ever discussing Wyoming, Montana, Utah, South Dakota, North Dakota, right? That's just, we don't have evidence of that. And they don't go there that often at this point with the electoral college anyway.
Great. Thank you. And I am entering a link into the chat right now for anybody who would like to pull up and save for later, obviously. Dr. Augenbaugh's most recent podcast on election certification, because that is a process that he talks about having lots of uncertainty in it as well. So whatever we don't touch on here, I'm sure we will touch on in that podcast. So that's there for you. Kelsey, do you want to take the next one too?
Yes. So the next question is, the president has encouraged his supporters to monitor the polls on election day and has refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power if he loses the election. Obviously, that is a big if, and he could win. But if the polls are right and he doesn't win, many people seem concerned that our democracy could slip into something that looks more like faux democracies in more authoritarian states. Are the circumstances of our election and our overall political climate similar to those of other countries where a non-democratic government emerged? Could we see any sort of constitutional crisis arise in response to a hotly contested election?
Thanks. And I suppose I should amend that real quick for Dr. Winterseek and say, if the interpretation of the polls by the media and everyday Americans is right, and not if the polls are right. Bill, do you want to start us off on this question?
Yeah, okay, let me jump in. And this is going to sound a little bit scary and a lot of doom and gloom. But I study the presidency and teach the presidency, but I'm also was trained in comparative politics. And when you look at elections around the world and you look at how democracies actually collapse, this is a textbook case of how democracies collapse. You have a presidential candidate, well, a president who says, gee, I'm not sure if I'm going to buy the elections if I lose, and a vice president who says the same thing, and a Trump candidacy, which is basically running partly against Biden, but also running partly against the notion that we can have a fair election at all, right? And he did this, Trump did this in 2016, basically said, unless I win, it's fraud. And that's how elections collapse. That's how democracies end at that point. Because if you can actually delegitimize the electoral process and say it cannot be fair, then that excuses any behavior whatsoever. And the Constitution is no longer valid at that point, and the electoral process is no longer valid, and you wind up, as you have in a lot of countries, with two people saying that they're president. And then that leads to people coming out in the streets, and that leads to, sadly, violence. And that we may be at the election which sets the precedent for, sadly, if other countries are a clue to this, 30 years of electoral violence before everybody gets tired of it. And we revise the Constitution and we revise a lot of laws. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night, like literally, because that's kind of where we are. And partly we're that way because of polarization, and partly we're that way because of actual fake news, as opposed to the thing that's called fake news when it's just actually just analysis that one political party doesn't like. And that's a scary, scary proposition. I mentioned in some of our earlier discussions about this, it's a great book by Sinclair Lewis called It Can Happen Here. And the thing that worries me is that it already happened. We've already gone past the point where we're going to have elections that are based on two parties respecting the process. And if that's where we are, we're already on the move toward rebuilding the next republic of the United States when we try to repair the damage that we've done over the past couple of elections.
Thanks, Bill. Augie, do you want to talk to any of the potential crises, constitutional crises that could arise from this?
Yeah, and before I do, I just want to second something that Bill just mentioned, and that is whether it's Sinclair Lewis's book or a book that I've used in the Crisis in Democracy course, Levitsky and Zablat's How Democracies Die. I mean, a fundamental issue here, folks, is this notion of unwritten rules of politics. Now, Allie just asked me about, constitutional, if you will, issues, okay? But there are many rules of politics in the United States that aren't rooted in the US Constitution. Two of which that Levitsky and Zablat mentioned are mutual toleration and forbearance, okay? If you have a political party or both political parties basically willing to accept the outcome of an election, even if they don't like their opponent all that much, or even if they think the election has some fraud involved, okay, then you have a peaceful transition of power, okay? Forbearance gets at, the extent to which you use the authority given to you within your office, okay? We're at a place right now where the US Constitution doesn't go ahead and cover an extraordinary event like a sitting president that refuses to concede an election and refuses the peaceful transition of power. There's no clause in the Constitution that covers that, right? There's no fine print. The United States Congress hasn't passed a law that, gives the chairman of the Joint Chiefs the authority to go ahead and step in. None of that's covered in law or the Constitution. So the scary thought here is what, Bill's pointed to, and what you see in, faux democratic nation states, okay? Usually an incumbent, but not always an incumbent, but typically an incumbent loses a re-election and says the election was fraudulent. The voice of the people is being suppressed, and I'm not stepping down. And I've been asked with some regularity, Allie, well, then what happens constitutionally? I can go ahead and give you the timeline and the link to the podcast that Allie just posted in the chat. That gives the two constitutional dates that are important and the 3 or 4 statutory dates. But if they're not followed, okay, who's going to go ahead and step in and say, well, you must follow them? And that's the truly scary thought. I mean, say what you want about the 2000 presidential election, but when Al Gore went ahead and conceded, okay, that was an example of mutual toleration. And I'm not entirely sure we're going to go ahead and see that with all of the other irregularities that may occur next month. Okay. And again, I don't necessarily mean to, lay on the sky is falling shtick. But, hey, constitutions don't answer all questions.
Especially ours.
True.
I mean, it's not very long. We assign our students term papers longer than the Constitution.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. This next one, I have Dr. Winterseek and Dr. Condit on the spot. Media professionals often point out that they're covering a type of politics they aren't used to. And many critics of the media would point out that that shows. In what ways are the media shaping our expectations as American voters? And what do you think they've gotten right or wrong or done well or poorly in their coverage of the 2020 presidential election cycle? Dr. Winterseek, you want to start?
Sure. The media is so complicit. And as numerous of our panel members have pointed out, democracies die. And I really wish I'd seen more in that book about how the media can be complicit. And the media is complicit in 2016 when it chooses to cover a presidential candidate who lies and states falsehoods all up and down the campaign trail, right? Giving that individual a legitimate platform. And today, in addition to them continuing to misinterpret what polls actually mean, we continue to see this complicit nature. That is, the media continues to treat political parties as if they are democratic institutions. And we've talked a lot about what is covered in our Constitution and not covered. Political parties are not specified anywhere in our Constitution. Political parties are private interest groups. And as private interest groups, they're concerned with winning elections so they can construct the rules of the game to advantage their political party in subsequent elections. And so I have a heavy criticism of the media for treating the political parties like they're democratic institutions, for providing an equal platform to these political parties, particularly when we have one political party that is peddling falsehoods, right? Not being clear about attempts by the Republican Party through policy mechanisms, and in the past couple days, more blatant mechanisms, Republican Party in California dropping off fake ballot drop boxes, about the attempt to suppress the vote. And so what has the media gotten right? I'm not sure that I can say that they've gotten a whole hell of a lot right this election. They follow the horse race. They feed us a steady diet of who's winning and who's losing, and that undermines our democracy. Our media is failing their fourth function as a role of government, that is to be the watchdog.
Yep. Dr. Condit, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I actually think maybe we ought to change the question, right?
Okay.
We ought to ask, what is the goal of the media in a for-profit media world? In order to understand a whole lot about humans, you got to begin with kind of my follow the toilet paper lecture, right? Which has a whole new meaning after COVID, right? But you got to follow the toilet paper. Who wants to sell the toilet paper ad? Because when we talk about the media, and we got to disaggregate that, it's fragmented, it's become multiple things. We think of it as kind of the television media, which is where, you know, about 50% of people still get the big bulk of their news and information, but that's even generational now, right? The media is also online and radio and podcasts. There's a tiny little percentage of people who still read print news, right? But all of that in a society that has created a for-profit engine to drive the media is about figuring out how to get people to click, how to people to get the toilet paper, how to get people to use your products, and the media centers around that. And so what is it that then drives humans, right? We're really effective as beings, and so we love the excitement. Like, we need to be lit up. And what we're in this now in this election, Dr. Winterseek talked about the horse race. Well, why do you care if it's a horse race? Because if it's Donald Trump is polling at 88% and Joe Biden is polling at 10% tomorrow and the day after, nobody turns on the TV and pays attention to that. They flip over to Schitt's Creek instead, right? And so you've got to have the media's job. Was that God? The media's job is to get you to garner an audience to center on whatever advertising mechanism it has, overwhelmingly. And so when Dr. Winterseek talks about the media is doing a terrible job, they're actually doing their job really well. They are doing their job really well. It's that democracy needs a different thing in order for democracy. It doesn't need ad agencies. It needs actual information dissemination. It needs actual reporting. The other thing about the media that we got to pay attention to is that journalism is not an analytic discipline. It's a storytelling discipline. And so journalists' job is to take snapshots and tell stories, which means they contextualize them. Well, what is a story? Why do we listen to stories? Because effectively, we like beginning, middle, and end. We like normalcy. We like things to be fair. We like things to be even if they're not going to be titillating and exciting, right? And so the media tends to construct stories in that way. So it repeats the history, it makes us feel comfortable, it normalizes at the end. And that's part of what's going on with this election, is that the second part of the question was, how are they, or the first part was, how are they shaping expectations and what are they doing? They're normalizing Donald Trump's campaign. But remember, Donald Trump is one of them. Most broadcast medias are, if you look at their resumes, they don't list themselves as journalists, they list themselves as television personalities, right? Well, Donald Trump is a television personality, and so they understand him and he understands them. He understands clickbaitism. He understands how to stay in front of them in such a way that it's like they can't look away because they understand him. He is them. And so the cameras are constantly focused on him, and he's really good at that. That means then that we have a very distorted perspective. It's not analytical, it's telling stories. What are the stories we've seen in the last 3 weeks? Your heads should all be spinning. The Donald Trump stories have gone from bad debate performance to the next day to has COVID, got cured of COVID, came out and was going to come in a Superman outfit, is now cured of COVID, is now apparently the only human in the history of humanity that's never going to get COVID again. I mean, like, that rapidity is his method of saying, here, watch me in the ads that come around me. You can sell your toilet paper because you're going to focus on me and I'm going to get the audience for you. He's very, very good at that. And that's exactly what the media has been doing. The flip side of that is they're really negative things. And I can't let this go without saying this, and I know I'm running out of time, but I can't let this go without pointing this out. And we got to turn it around and look at the treatment of the candidates who are not Donald Trump. And the most important for me treatment is the media's treatment of Kamala Harris. So there's already early research. We've developed a real phalanx of feminist scholars who are media savvy and study media. And already the evidence is that there's just a ton of racist and sexist media coverage of Kamala Harris. In the 2 weeks before the first vice presidential debate, 61% of the media coverage of Kamala Harris discussed her race and or her gender, but only 5% of the media coverage of either Mike Pence in this election or Tim Kaine in the previous election as the vice presidential candidate ever discussed their race or their sex, right? If we look at the coverage, just even of questions of something like the religiosity, both Tim Kaine and Mike Pence, media coverage is about 20% of the time they discuss their religious orientation, 1% for Kamala Harris. So what does that communicate and shape the voters, the watchers, the readers? That she's an angry black woman, right? And that, which is the trope that is very clear there, and that she's not religious. Well, in America, there's two things you can never be as a candidate: an angry black woman and an atheist, right? And if you're not talking about her religion, if it's not central to the coverage as it is to the male candidate, then that shapes it. And that's just a sample of kind of what the media is doing outside of its inability to turn away from all things Donald Trump.
Thanks. One of the things, I don't know if either of you, I think somebody hit on it briefly, but it didn't come through in either answer. And so I can throw this back at either of you or open it up beyond, is social media too. So we do think of media a lot of the time as TV media, which, I mean, there's lots of different types of media out there that are not television, that are old too, but social media, which Donald Trump used so effectively to get that earned free coverage in the 2016 election and continues to do on a daily basis because it gives the media a story like Dr. Condit is talking about. they've been trying to reckon with public shaming of their inability or disinterest, maybe even, to ward off misinformation, and that capitalist instinct, which is misinformation is kind of good for our bottom line. Does anybody want to briefly address either the way social media has been behaving in this election compared to 2016, the way maybe foreign governments are entering into I mean, like, nobody's talking about Russia in 2020 that, well, not in my circles, maybe in yours, like, but I can't imagine they just stopped using social media after 2016. So I'll just let somebody jump in, because that was not a question that was previously on here, but we've got time for it.
I have Russia written all over my notes. I just didn't get to it.
So one thing I would note is that things have changed on the social media scene this election cycle pretty dramatically. And I mean, we have to sort of tip our hats in some ways, specifically to Twitter, because they have taken a leading role among social media outlets in pioneering new ways to stop the spread of misinformation, not just to identify misinformation and remove it from their platform, but to actively stop it. So for example, right now, Twitter is engaged in experimental work on a variety of issues. One of the ones that I personally find to be most interesting is that for a small sample of users, anytime they share an article, that if they have not opened up the link, they are prompted on whether or not they'd actually like to share that. And it says, we see you haven't actually opened this link. Are you sure you'd like to share this information? And so I think that Twitter, because they have a ever so slightly more committed to democratic outcomes than maybe their competitors, have pushed their competitors into a corner. And we've seen then that other social media networks like Facebook have subsequently put in place additional protections. Have they gone far enough? Probably not. But at least it seems that they're not just running amok to their capitalist instincts, so to speak. So.
Dr. Condit, what did all your notes that say Russia all over your paper say?
I actually have two notes that I get to. One is Russia, right? And we know, right? I've never in my life quoted the FBI. So this is like a new moment for me, but right? So we know that the FBI has pretty definitively indicated that we have tons of evidence that Russia is heavily involved in through social media, affecting this election, right? In this case, I'm going to take their word for it. And we are incredibly unskilled as consumers of social media at being able to even discern it. And their decision, the Russian decision in 2016 and now in 2020 to try and affect the election is so. We can't even have a conversation about it in the United States because it's ideologically driven now. Right. And I think that's a huge issue. And the other issue that I just want to leave there is we're at a really weird moment where the Democratic Party has formed an alliance with a very conservative Republican interest group, the Lincoln Project, and is cheering on the Lincoln Project's media efforts, when in fact they have almost nothing in common except an antithesis toward one candidate. And the impact, I think social scientists will be studying the impact of the Lincoln Project's work for the next 20 years, right? But I think it's an interesting potential Trojan horse that we see in the moment, that works in the moment of the election, but the impact on democracy, I think, is potentially really devastating. And so those two things in our media, I think we have to pay serious attention to.
I would note, stay tuned on that. Dr. Keena and I are actively collecting data on this specific aspect of the election, beyond the Lincoln Project as well, other conservative groups advocating for Biden and against Trump. And so perhaps in the spring, we'll have some preliminary results to share with you all.
Excellent.
Augie, was that a hand up, or I see a finger up by Newman? Either of you can jump in. I don't know if you both had something.
Yeah, I'll just be super quick to piggyback on what Deirdre said. So part of Russian foreign policy these days is an ideological conflict with democracy and the notion of democracy. And part of Russian foreign policy is to try to prove that democracy does not work, or that real democracy does not work. And the kind of democracy you get in Russia, where the president can stay president pretty much forever, and you change the constitution to make sure he can stay in power forever, that's real democracy. So there's an attempt to undermine the very notion that you can have real live democracy. And that's why Russia is interfering. And I think the Lincoln Project and its alliance with the Democratic Party, I mean, to me, I don't worry about that, because I see that the big commonality they have is they actually do believe in democracy. And I'm not quite sure about if that's true about Donald Trump and a lot of the people who support him. Their attitude is democracy gets in the way of victory, then we dispense with democracy. And I think the Lincoln Project is supporting the notion of democracy. And they're not going to be allied with the Democratic Party in the long run, and they shouldn't be, because you really would like to have competitive elections. Democrats aren't right about everything, Republicans aren't right about everything, and you want to have a system of two parties or more. But the notion that you're going to actually have a democracy to decide which one is going to lead, I think that consensus is a really important consensus, because I'm not sure we have that consensus is as strong as it used to be. And that to me is the scariest thing in the long run.
Thanks. Augie, had you raised a hand or had I now? Great, because Bill's comment just goes right into the next one. But before I read that next one, in the chat, I just posted the registration link for anybody who would like to attend tomorrow's Virginia Amendment 1 forum hosted by the Minority Political Leadership Institute. So pull that up and fill that out afterwards. It should be good, especially if you have not yet voted in the state of Virginia. If you did vote and you didn't know there was an amendment, you probably were confused at the ballot place, but nothing you can do about it now. All right. This one goes back to Dr. Newman and Augie. How might you expect the political parties, the political elites, and our political institutions to respond to potential uncertainties about the uncertain outcome of the election? What sorts of norms could be strained specifically to the responses of political actors? So I think in all of our responses so far, we've kind of been dancing around this issue. We've been alluding to democratic norms, but I don't know if we've spelled many of them out. We can perhaps talk about ones that have already been strained, just in general, but also how about after the election?
Augie, I just talked. Why don't you go ahead, and then I'll.
When we talk about democratic norms, and I frequently pose the question to the students, okay, so what are norms, democratic norms, that you believe that, for instance, the president or either political party have violated? And it's a question that stumps my students, and I think it stumps a lot of Americans. It's almost, it's kind of sort of like Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. You know it when you see it, right? Okay. But to give some, if you will, concrete substance to this, I'm going to go ahead simply because I referenced it earlier, just to use as an example, this idea of mutual toleration that Levitsky and Zablat mentioned. And Bill and I kind of sort of talked about this earlier with one of our previous, if you will, points. But the idea of respecting an outcome of an election is one of mutual toleration, where you can go ahead and say, I don't like my opponent, but I respect the fact that an election occurred, my opponent won, and because they won the election, they now have, if you will, the opportunity to exercise the authority of a position. I'm not entirely sure. And in fact, I feel more strongly about the Republican Party in this election. But I think both political parties have the potential to not respond well to outcomes of the election next month. Okay. what this means, and notice I'm bifurcating here, because the question mentions political parties and political elites. I'm not entirely sure political parties or political elites are going to go ahead and back down if they don't like the outcome of the elections next month. What I do see us once again turning to are a couple institutions that rather ironically are unelected. We're going to turn to bureaucratic officials in various states, again, unelected, and also judges, unelected, to go ahead and perhaps craft solutions that will at least allow us to go ahead and start governing in January of next year. And I'm not entirely sure that that's the best way to go ahead and do a democracy, where unelected officials and institutions that many people don't understand are kind of sort of saving the democracy. But that's what this election potentially holds as an outcome. Bill?
Yeah, when I think about norms, I think about past presidents and the way they operated toward a current president. And you go back and you look at, and I just was doing a ton of research on this, and the number of times that President Kennedy consulted Eisenhower afterwards, and they sat down and talked with each other about things. And when Kennedy was going to do something very big, they went and discussed it with Eisenhower first. And Eisenhower always said, you know, look, you're the president of the United States, and I will back you up on this, and I will argue for your policies once you make a decision, because you're the president right now. And actually only said there was one thing that I will disagree with you publicly, and it was whether you recognize China early in the early 1960s. And even Lyndon Johnson, you know, was discussing foreign policy, called in Richard Nixon and sat down with Richard Nixon in 1966, right as Nixon's gearing up to run in 1968, at which he would have been running against Johnson.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the way we used to operate. And the polarization has caused such a disconnect in which Obama gets elected, and Republicans' attitude is, well, what are we going to do for the next 4 years?
Yeah.
We're going to do everything in power to defeat Barack Obama so he can't be reelected. And that simply says, no, we're not going to solve problems over the next 4 years. Our goal is to prevent you from solving any problems, because then you'll get credit for it. And that's why we have policy that just doesn't solve things. We just argue about it.
Yeah, and this kind of sort of goes back to a point that Amanda made a few moments ago in regards to the nature of political parties, right? If they're only hell-bent on winning, okay, then what's the incentive for them to go ahead and cooperate with those who might, you know, win future elections at their expense? And that really does cause me concern, because your goal isn't to go ahead and govern. Your goal is to go ahead and defeat your opponent. Okay, so to what end? You defeated your opponent, but you're given then a position of authority to do something. And again, we could go ahead and change the system, but the way our system is set up, at some point you got to go ahead and work with the other side. Okay.
Yeah.
Silly things like separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, all kind of sort of require at some point in time cooperation. Even if it means you hold your nose while you're cooperating, that kind of sort of is required, right? But I mean, I really liked Amanda's point earlier, and I like, Bill, what you just went ahead and mentioned about how, where did we get out of this, out of the practice of being able to go ahead and sit down with people from the other side and say, hey, you've experienced this. Can you give me advice and counsel? I mean, that's not a sign of weakness, okay? That's actually a sign of being smart, right?
And the dilemma, I think, is that if a Democrat's in office, when you solve a problem, the Democrat gets the credit for it, so the Republicans have to stop it, and Democrats would do the same thing to Republicans. And one of the great ways of seeing that is the Affordable Care Act. Whether you like it or you don't like it, if you were going to say, let's replace it with something else, you might put it down on paper and say, here's what we'd replace it with. And it's been 9 years, and Republicans still have not come up with an alternative, because solving the problem is not what they're thinking about. It's blaming Democrats for the problem, because that's how they think they can go ahead and win. And again, Democrats have done the same thing. I think that's the polarized environment we're in. And Ali asked about social media, and that just makes it worse. It just amplifies everything to the biggest extreme when you can be anonymous about things. And I've said to my students a couple times that, yeah, this is essentially the environment that people my age created, and sorry, but we hand it to you and say, please fix it.
Yeah, when I think of democratic norms, I'm thinking kind of too of just, we have a Supreme Court confirmation hearing going on right now under very similar circumstances as 4 years ago when Senate Majority Leader went ahead and prevented Barack Obama's nominee from getting a hearing. That was far further away from the election than we are right now. And it's kind of been interesting for me to watch the last 4 years, because on the one hand, Trump doesn't have a ton of like legislative victories. He has his tax cuts, but a lot of the other norm breaking he's done has kind of been allowed still by the Republican Party, and sometimes encouraged if it gets them to the outcome they want, such as the current hearings. But he's still himself been fairly ineffective, at least per my vantage point. And so to me, that's kind of a interesting dichotomy, that he's ineffective at doing actual things, but very effective at breaking norms. And the Republican Party right now seems disinterested in checking him, and what that might mean for the day after the election if he refuses to leave the White House. And again, that's a big if, because he could win. But I don't know, thoughts on whether we should expect more from the Republican Party itself if Trump is refusing to leave, and it looks like he should?
So I can't, one of the questions that I mull a lot right now is that we've had this thing coming, and, scholars are trying to pinpoint when it happened, right? Was it with Nixon? Was it with Bill Clinton? The impeachment hearing against Bill Clinton that ended up in him not being, the Democrats did not hold him accountable. Was it Nixon flaunting the law, though he did resign when the Republicans went to him and said, you gotta resign or we're going to impeach you? I'm not sure. Some people are pinpointing it, frankly, to Newt Gingrich in 92, right? That Gingrich set out with a plan to kind of decompose the rule of law respect among the Republican Party, and took the Republican Party in a very different direction. I'm not sure I understand where that moment happened, that particularly the Republican Party, the elected Republican Party, and then adherents to parts of it have reached a point where they are willing to ignore the norms, right? And Mitch McConnell has been clear and blatant in his willingness to eschew the norms of the Senate, for example. But I think that's a really different question than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has always been the guy who was anti-law. He's been anti-law from his childhood. I mean, when he started to run for president, when he started his first run, he had 3,500 attorneys on retainer. I mean, that's more than most corporations keep, right? And he did that because he programmatically has spent his life working to thwart law. He's an anti-law guy. I always call him the first outlaw president, right? Because he does not believe in law. He does not believe in the constraints of law. He does not believe in the norms of constraining of subscription to law. And so for him, this is just part and parcel of who he is, and what he's not going to step away from the White House because he doesn't think there's a law that the laws aren't relevant to him, right? But I don't understand, for me personally, and maybe my colleagues are so wisely can help me, because I don't understand where the marriage happened. The marriage happened around abortion. The marriage happened around LGBTQ rights. The marriage happened around racism. I mean, those pieces of that marriage that happened for the Republican Party, maybe signaling the split in the Republican Party between the social conservatives and the fiscal conservatives who are lost in the wind and don't know where to live anymore, I think, politically. But I can't understand their willingness unless it's just pure craven. He'll give us what we want if we give him what he wants.
Bill, take us home on this, and then we'll hit our last two questions before closing statements and lingering questions.
I think part of what happened, the reason why you have Trump, right? So you think about the general election, right? You can understand why Donald Trump might be Hillary Clinton if abortion is a big factor, right? Because then you've got a certain percentage of the American people who are not going to vote for the Democratic candidate, period, end of conversation, and that's it. It's harder to understand how he got the Republican nomination when you've got 17 other people who are pro-life. And I think, to me, when I've thought about this, and the only thing I can come up with is that McCain lost and Romney lost, and they were both more moderate Republicans. And in that battle between moderate Republicans and the movement conservatives, right, who get their political ideology comes from Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and Fox News, right? And so is that ideology against more of the traditional Republicans? And even George W. Bush was a traditional Republican.
Sure.
Right? George W. Bush gets the United States involved in Iraq. And George W. Bush doesn't eliminate abortion. And then McCain loses and Romney loses. And even worse for a certain percentage of people in the United States, sadly, in those years, he loses to an African American, right? And then Donald Trump comes along and he can grab all the attention. And I think a lot of people just said, hey, he's what he is, but he's our guy. Right. So therefore, I can quote FDR talking about certain Latin American dictators. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Right. So we go with him. So it's sort of this grand experiment by people saying we need to get the White House back, by whatever means necessary. And this is what you get. And democracy may be the thing that we really lose in the long run. And somebody asked the question, is democracy saved if Trump wins and that we don't have a constitutional crisis? On the other hand, what does a guy who has no respect for the democratic process do in his second term?
Yeah.
Right? Far worse than he would do in a first term.
Great. I've got this one for Dr. Winterseek and Dr. Condit. So far, I've been asking everybody about institutions, about politicians, about everybody but we, the people, but we're a big part of this story. What is the public's impression of the election leading up to the big day, and how might you expect the public to respond to the outcome of the election, whether the outcome's uncertain or whether we have a winner, Trump or Biden, that a large portion of the population does not want?
I think Dr. Condit should go first, since I've spoken first the last couple times.
When I do television stuff, the one thing I say is I'm not in the business of reading crystal balls. And so I'm always hesitant to try to prognosticate. But I think we have some things that some data points that we can look at to give us some hints. I think that the American populace, what we see most right now is Americans are kind of a normal curve, and the media focuses attention on the ends of the two curves. The guys with the AK-47s or whatever those guns are on one end, and the really angry, whoever they are, folks on the other end, right? But if you look at over the last 4 years, when people have protested, they have protested, with the exception of the tails perhaps, they have protested peacefully. They have come out in huge numbers. They have spoken back in ways that I continue to think are democratic and that I admire. For me, the question is the guys with the guns. When you have 90% of the weapons in the United States in the hands of 3% of the population, a kind of concern and resort that I don't understand. I understand just yesterday some guy checked into one of the resort hotels at Disney World with like automatic weapons because he was afraid that while he was at Disney World, Antifa was going to attack his family. It's not a thing I even begin to understand, right? Those are the people who I think we can't understand and predict. I think the overwhelming amount of Americans still subscribe to things like the rule of law, courteousness. We tend to be a fairly, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it's been extraordinary in the ability to make a political commentary and express the political ideology and demands on a society without violence. And I suspect that and perhaps to our detriment, but I suspect that there will be some anger, some acting out. But really, if you look at the overall arch, I suspect Americans will respond and assume it will get better, right? Because we're a people of hope. Will it get better if the democracy crumbles? That's a question I'm not wise enough to answer. But I think Americans will go to bed expecting bad things because the media wants us to, but will overall respond fairly reasonably regardless of the outcome. But I don't have a crystal ball.
Dr. Winterseek, do you have a different read?
I think I do have a slightly different read, although I think our basis is the same, right? That we really have two Americas here, and everybody tuned in tonight, you are a part of one distinct group of Americans, and that is a highly interested and engaged segment of the population. You all are voters, right? What I think we need to recall is that we have about 230 million adults in the United States, and we only see about 130 million of them showing up to vote. And so we have the group of people who are highly engaged and who are interested, and they're being driven in this election either by positive partisanship on the Republican side, really truly being a fan of their candidate Donald Trump, although there are some underlying motivations there as well. I think that this idea of owning the libs is an underlying motivation for being such a supporter of Donald Trump. And then you have the other side, which is a group of highly committed Democrats who are not at all excited about a Biden candidacy or necessarily even a Biden presidency. And they're being driven by negative partisanship. Their goal is anybody but Trump, with this idea, as Dr. Condit points out, is to get back to this rule of law, to get back to some normal or normalization of what politics looked like in America prior to a Donald Trump presidency. But then we have this entire group of people in the middle, and I'm really concerned about this group. And I'm concerned about this group because one of the main things we see coming out of this group in the middle, this 100 million or 120 million people who aren't that interested in politics and aren't that engaged and didn't vote in 2016, is that they really view both sides as being equally as bad. And we simply can't say that that's the case today. We have a Republican Party led by a president who continually lies and misleads the American public, who relies on ad hominem attacks against his political opponents instead of facts and science, whose position on any number of issues changes day to day based on what will get him the best rating or the most number of retweets. And so this is a group of Americans that concerns me, that the media hasn't done a good job of informing these people, that we really have a choice. And that is a choice between democracy or perhaps falling into some new form of government, as has been elaborated by Dr. Newman and by Augie, of effectively a dictatorship, right? Falling victim to our own sort of notions about what this election means. So I think that we don't necessarily disagree, but I think I'm a little bit more cynical about that group in the middle, perhaps.
I also remember chatting with you a couple months ago about an article that I don't remember which paper it was in, that had done a series of essentially like game theory exercises to see how things would play out. Do you remember what it was that they had been talking about?
Yes.
I'm putting you
so,
on
I
the
mean,
spot.
Sure. And political experts are doing this, right? They're playing a series of war games, and this is ongoing to sort of predict what will happen. And what you should note about that article is those were the most extreme outcomes they were predicting. But in all 5 of the war games they played, there's only one scenario that doesn't result in violence. And that was a decisive Biden victory, right? Where Biden takes 374 or 375 electoral college votes. What we would predict based on the polling is that that's not going to be the case. If Biden wins, it'll probably be closer to about 316 electoral votes. And under that war game, there was some limited violence. And let's be very clear about where that violence comes from. It comes from extremists on the right. The Southern Poverty Law Center has said this very clearly. White supremacists and neo-Nazi groups are the greatest domestic terror threat we face.
And we kind of have an example of how the left has responded to unpopular elections now twice in the last 5 cycles when they lost the Electoral College but won the popular vote. The big change right now is that survey after survey is talking about how both parties don't trust the system at rates that was much higher than in 2016 lead up or 2000. I read something just the other day because I actually couldn't vote in 2000. I was 3 days too young, and I was a college freshman. And so I don't remember it a ton, and so some of my other colleagues can perhaps weigh in. But I was reading something that was really interesting that was even the majority of people who thought that all the votes needed to be counted in Florida and favored a longer timeline and disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision. Once Gore had been had conceded and once Bush was named the winner, something like 84% of those people who thought that it was unfair were still like, yes, I will legitimately accept Al Gore's loss and George Bush as my president. And I don't know that we'd have that on the left today. I don't know that we'd have the violence that the war games were predicting from the other side either. But I do wonder how the left would react differently in 2020 versus 2000 and 2016. It's like, I don't know, the third time, like, you're just getting beaten like with unfairness over and over. And at some point, it seems like the left might also not respond particularly great. Did anybody have thoughts on that before I pass the last question off to Kelsey?
I'll let someone else answer the substance of the question, but note that I have you beat. I was in middle school in 2000.
Well, I mean, in part, Allie, you're talking about a well-known political science concept, efficacy. I mean, after a while, if you don't think the system works and you don't think the institutions work, you feel a lack of efficacy. And for those of us who are, shall we say, somewhat older than Allie and Amanda, okay? I mean, for our generation, this kind of sort of begs an important question. Do we want subsequent generations of Americans to have even less trust? I mean, let's understand, there are subpopulations in the United States who already have significant trust issues as it relates to the system and governing institutions. But if you have a series of elections where the popular vote doesn't match the electoral college vote, or it looks like you have institutions stepping in and deciding no matter how you cast your vote, kind of sort of begs an important question. Are we breeding a couple generations of Americans who are like, who cares, right? I mean, are we tapping into the 100 million to 120 million that Amanda just mentioned a few moments ago? Those who don't vote, and no matter what economists tell me in regards to rational ignorance, let's face it, okay? those Americans who aren't voting, not all of them are making a conscious decision not to vote, okay? They're basically throwing up their hands and saying, what? I don't care. And, you know, for those of us who teach political science, that should alarm us, right?
Right.
Though, you know, can I just
go
say
ahead.
this because
Yeah.
we haven't said it?
Yeah.
There are 18,000 Americans who have died. By the time this election comes and goes, that number could be north of 250,000. Multiply that times, on average, 10 people who are their loved ones. We're talking about a significant portion of the American population who have been personally directly affected by the coronavirus crisis. And one of the things we know as political theorists is that most changed regimes come not when things are great, but they come when societies are failed states. And one of the great failed state signs is when there are dead bodies lying in your streets. And we have as close to that as a metaphor as we can possibly get in the United States. And so those coronavirus crises have affected those folks who are non-voters, disaffected voters as well. I'm not suggesting I can predict how this is going to affect them, but they've also lost their jobs. And they have not been able to sort of not care quite as much as Dr. Augenbaugh suggests, if for no other reason that they are touched personally in a way right now that they might not have been touched 5 years ago, right, as non-voters. And how those folks are going to react, either whether they're registering to vote, which we're seeing some uptick in registration, but it's also hard to register people we know because of coronavirus, right, which is the mitigating factor. Or if the election goes some way that they don't understand, right, or don't want, whether they, you know, have processed that or not, I don't know, but I do think it's a really important thing for us to remember that we teeter on the brink of a failed state because so many Americans are really truly suffering, and I think that changes the surety of our country right now.
I mean, that goes right back to breaking norms too, about how you allocate aid during a crisis, things of that nature too, and how the party has responded or not responded to that sort of behavior. Kelsey, go ahead and ask our last question. This is one that Dr. Kina, I had signed you up for this, but this is one that wasn't on our original list. So if you don't know, there might not even be an answer to this question. Take a stab at it, and then if anybody else wants to add on, they can. So go ahead, Kelsey.
The last question will end on something that's likely been on everyone's mind since Donald Trump was admitted to the hospital briefly after testing positive for COVID-19. What is the standard procedure if a candidate falls terminally ill or passes away during an election? What happens if terms of debates, traditional electoral proceedings, or for the run itself?
So the answer is there are no standard procedures, not for a presidential election. In some congressional elections, a candidate has died, and if it's too close to election day to remove their name from a ballot, they might have the candidate's wife run in the candidate's stead. This has never really happened before. The Constitution has the 25th Amendment, which was passed in the 60s, which provides a mechanism for removing a president who's ill. Back in the 19-teens, we now know that Woodrow Wilson was sick for many months, and his wife was essentially running the country and negotiating with the Senate as they are considering his treaty after World War I. And so the way our country, the way our democracy works is it doesn't move quickly. When we see problems, we have to patch it up, particularly in our system where it's particularly hard to change the Constitution. The threshold is quite high. So this is an experiment and it's a work in progress. And you know that's perhaps a conversation we need to have after the election is what do we do as a nation that we can all agree on, at least 3/5 of us can agree on to make sure that doesn't ever happen. Personally, I'm happy that the president isn't dead. I'm glad that we avert this constitutional crisis because that's really uncharted territory.
Thanks. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Or I think there is no answer is probably the right answer. That gets back to Augie's comment about the Constitution not covering a whole lot. Awesome. There is a very lively conversation going on in the chat right now about Antifa. So we're going to go to closing statements. But if anybody wants to touch on the conversation about Antifa and violence perhaps coming from that part of the political spectrum, depending on the outcome of the election, you can go ahead and do that. I think the way I've been using the terms left and right has been many people who are Republicans own guns. And the Republican Party itself uses rhetoric about Second Amendment and militias and defending freedoms in a way where the Democratic Party doesn't really claim Antifa as their own or necessarily have that same actual arsenal like available to them the day after the election. And so I see a distinction there, but there's probably others as well. So you can or can't address Antifa if you'd like, and then we'll also do closing statements. So Amanda, I just heard your voice, then we'll go to Michael, who hasn't talked in a while, and then go down
Since
the line.
my comments sparked the debate, I'm happy to take the first whack at this. So this is again a failing of the media as well as framing by President Trump of what the right and the left actually means when it comes to right-wing extremism versus Antifa. We should be very clear. The Antifa is not a fan of the Democratic Party, right? They're also not an organized movement. They're not nearly as organized as groups like the Boogaloo Boys or other groups that we've seen since the 2016 election arising on the right. And these groups have always been there, right? But they've also come to the forefront of our politics. They are forming militias. Militias are not legal, right? These are extra legal militias. They're arming themselves. They're going to do weekend training programs. And there's a great deal of evidence to show that if we look at violence in the United States, at least as a summer, and I think now unfortunately we do have some a small number of deaths linked to people who associated with the Antifa movement. But going all the way back to 1994, as of midsummer, the extreme right had killed upward of 300 plus Americans, whereas Antifa was responsible for 0 deaths. And I think that that number today is now at 1 or maybe 2 as we moved through the fall. So to treat these two groups as if they are the same is a fallacy, and it is not based in the data, but merely in the rhetoric.
Awesome. Michael, any last thoughts?
Yes, I will. Well, I guess I'll address this too. Just speaking personally as a private citizen, not as a political scientist, I don't particularly have a problem with guns or gun ownership. What I have a problem with is vigilantism. And generally speaking, from a comparative context, when we see the rise of armed vigilante groups, this is a symbol of a failed state. And in other countries, what we call them are paramilitaries. Now, paramilitaries serve useful purposes for oftentimes authoritarian leaders. They are more powerful when they have the implicit backing of the incumbent president or incumbent party, and they serve a purpose, which is to give some plausible deniability for things that a president cannot order, official state security forces to do, such as voter suppression or intimidating political opponents. And so this is, I think, the worry, this general, that not simply the presence of these groups, but that what it symbolizes, the breakdown of democratic norms and the rule of law generally. And so this is what I worry about. And in terms of just what will happen on election day, I think the best thing we can do is just try to be patient and try to not take drastic action and just see what happens. I think probably a lot of things will become, we hope, clearer in a few days, but it's not going to be decisive right away. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Also, tweeting out to liberate certain states and then having right-wing groups follow up on it is also not a great look, I suppose. And and also a mark of, oh, well, I didn't mean that. So some of that perhaps plausible deniability. Alex?
Is this a closing statement or?
Closing statement, if you'd like.
Okay, so so one of the things that I take from this conversation is that I kind of feel like crap, and it makes me feel terrible, and it's emotionally somewhat draining. But I want to temper this conversation with a bit of optimism. I don't think we're a failed state. We have the oldest, most durable constitutional democracy in the world. We've been through worse. We had a civil war. Lots of people died. But we ultimately ended up better off after the Civil War. And it resulted in a lot of conflicts that we're not really fighting anymore. That's not to say that I expect violence or I want violence. I don't necessarily expect violence. I hope that after this election, there will be a conclusive winner. And as Professor Palborg noted, we should all be patient. So I think a lot of people probably watching this might be somewhat dismayed, but I would just say, if you are feeling like this is affecting your ability to sleep and you're worrying about this, turn off the TV, go outside and take a hike, and make sure you vote. And if you need to protest at some point, then by all means, engage in some self-care and prepare to protest when that's peacefully, when the time comes. One other thing I want to say is I don't think that if the president is reelected, that we are going to see the end of American democracy. The one thing that I have learned watching 4 years of this administration is that the Republican Party is constrained by the president's extreme incompetence and his inability to manage a massive bureaucracy, and by the fact that the president's number one agenda is to promote himself. It's a very real possibility that the only reason he wants to stay in office is to avoid having to pay his massive debts that he's accrued while he's been running for president in the few years before. So I think that what happens if the president wins, if something happens where he manages to win a bare majority of the Electoral College, it'll probably be a popular vote minority. And what happens is the Democrats end up retaining the House, possibly taking the Senate. It's increasingly likely the Democrats will take the Senate. And Trump does literally nothing for 4 years except change a bunch of executive orders that are cruel and heartless, and keeps the kids locked in cages, bans some immigration to some other countries, and we have a little bit of instability for 4 years. That's my optimistic read on this. I don't think this is the end of the republic. The one thing that we have seen is that our state governments, in some ways that have been personally frustrating for me as a political science to watch the inefficiency of our federalist system, that's also a blessing in disguise, because while the federal government has stalled and looks incredibly incompetent and looks like all sorts of gridlock is slowing things down, we don't have solutions for healthcare, for immigration. States have been crafting their own solutions. And I am very optimistic about living in Virginia and seeing some of the progress that we've made in Virginia, and it's happening in other states as well. States are pretty much getting the job done. And to be honest, I feel like seeing what I've seen in the past few months in Virginia, what's happened as a result of the George Floyd protests and what's happened as a result of COVID-19, it's made me very proud to be a Richmonder. It's made me proud to be somebody who's lived in Virginia most of my life. And it's made me encouraged about the prospect of 4 years, even if it's with a president who has no respect for rule of law. So that's how I will close. I know this is a minority opinion here, but I want to give you all something to go off of so that you get some sleep tonight.
Dr. Condit, do you want to make people not be able to sleep tonight?
No, actually, I was trying to give you all my curve, right? I think the center of my normal curve. I would not begin to predict how this election is going to turn out in many ways, but I actually think there's lots of really interesting signs that Americans are going to quietly go in and vote with their family need. Not ubiquitously, but I think this is going to be a surprise.
Uh-oh.
We lost Dr. Condit for a moment. She might come back. But let's bounce to Dr. Augenbaugh until we get her back.
Significant enough for Joe Biden, I think, before, and I hope. Oh, am I gone? Am I
You were
there?
gone for a moment.
Oh, that's because everybody in my house is working on Zoom right now, I'm sure. uh, uh, to follow up, Alex, I've used this analogy before. You know, if you watch Harry Potter, when you watch the Harry Potter series, everybody thinks it's Harry and Hermione and Ron Weasley that saved the day. It's really not. It's Neville, right? And if there is any Neville character in American democracy, it's Joe Biden. He is the exact guy who stands up and gives that beleaguered speech, you know, to the Dark Lord that says, you know, you don't have anything, we have something to die for, you don't, because really you're already dead, and we have each other. And I really think that if you listen to Joe Biden's speech, he's Neville Longbottom. That's the speech he's giving, and Americans overwhelmingly are willing. Their grandparents are sick and dying. They have lost a kid to this virus. Their father doesn't have a job. Their mother is working 3 jobs part-time, coming home terrified in 30 masks. We as a nation are all experiencing this. We really are all in this together. It was the myth at the beginning that President Trump tried to project that it wasn't going to be that. Somebody said it's like asking somebody to pee in one side of the pool and expecting it to stay there. The pee's all the way through the pool now. And I think that is what brings this country, brings humans together, to not continue to do things that are harmful to themselves. And that's what we need from politics. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement has been so important. That's why the Women's March was so important and continues to resonate throughout this country. And I think that the coronavirus and the fallout from it are the things that I think ultimately people will choose. I don't really understand all that other stuff, but I'm going to choose Neville Longbottom. And I think that whether that will work in the long run and save America, I don't know, but I'm confident. I feel that's a possible positive outcome.
Thanks. I've never seen Harry Potter, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Everyone may now boo Dr. Reckendorf.
Dr. Augenbaugh and then Dr. Newman, and then there is somebody who had a question that they asked earlier that we will stay around for a couple extra minutes so that person can hear the answer to that. But we are approaching 9 o'clock. So before Dr. Augenbaugh and Dr. Newman go, I've just put in the chat RSVP form for a panel we'll do in 2 weeks. That will not up, and now it's lost again because the chat is still vibrant. But you can find it. It's a link to an RSVP. We'll send it to email too, so you guys can find it. But we're going to be back. We're going to be talking about different things, not uncertainty, because now we've covered that, but all sorts of other things related to the election. So fill that out so that you are able to attend in a couple of weeks if you'd like. Dr. Augenbaugh.
Thanks, Allie. I guess, and by the way, for our audience members, this wasn't really scripted in the sense that I'm actually going to join the basic theme of the closing remarks of Deirdre, Alex, and Michael, and that is, yes, I've probably contributed to some of you all maybe not sleeping all that well, the gloom and doom, if you will. On the other hand, as Michael, mentioned, and as Alex mentioned, let's put this in a larger context. And that is, some of these issues that we mentioned tonight have been longstanding problems that the country has had with the vote. Maybe I'm too much of an old Enlightenment era thinker, but I mean, once you identify the problem, then perhaps you can go ahead and begin to figure out solutions to address the problem. So, problems like voter suppression, state capacity issues, perhaps an over-reliance on unelected bureaucrats and judicial institutions to address these problems, maybe we begin to start addressing them simply because we've had a president that has caused many of us to say, oh shit. As Dr. Conda just pointed out, we have a pandemic that is, killed a couple 100,000 people and may directly affect, the most democratic of functions, the vote. So much like Michael, I encourage you all to be patient after Election Day. Even in the normal circumstances, counting ballots can be a labor-intensive process. Humans make mistakes. We make mistakes when we cast them. We make mistakes when we count them. And it's not because of evil intent or fraud, okay? We make mistakes, all right? And for those of you who are still dreading perhaps another 4 years of Trump administration, I cannot strongly enough concur with Alex's comment. And that is, his administration, okay, has been absolutely horrendous at running the executive branch. Okay? Absolutely terrible. Okay? The truly scary thing is if he had actually populated his administration with folks who know how to maneuver the levers of government, we then could have an, oh my God, what's happening situation. But he can't keep good people, okay? And the people around him, okay, wouldn't know how to go ahead and issue a government regulation if it hit him upside the head, okay? His executive orders have been jokes. Bill Newman and I stopped making jokes about them because they're so terribly written and there's so many of them, okay? So for those of you who really fear the fall of the Republic if Trump wins, remember, he ain't gonna get shit done anyways, okay? So let's hold on for 4 more years. Okay, I'm done.
Man, you guys are all so much more optimistic than I am. I feel like we lack some imagination. Dr. Newman.
So you want me to bring it down then?
No, you don't. No, I don't want you to do anything of the sort.
Go, Bill.
All right. Okay. Well, I think that picking back on what Augie said, right? The incompetence, right? Let's look at the incompetence, right? 210,000 people killed from the coronavirus, right? In 10 months. The Civil War ran 154,000 people a year. So this is the worst that the United States has ever faced in terms of executive failure and the failure of government. This is it, right? And if then we reelect the person who's in charge of that, you got to wonder about our ability to make judgments about anything. And I don't say that as a partisan in the sense that I really miss the old Republican Party. And I really miss the Eisenhowers and the George Herbert Walker Bushes, right? I've got a life-size cutout of Teddy Roosevelt in my office and he's wearing an I Like Ike button. So it's very possible that one thing that can come out of this is that whether Trump wins or loses, that part of the Republican Party that used to be thinking about competence and thinking about integrity in government, that party says, okay, we don't need this guy anymore. And we don't need the rabble. In fact, maybe the rabble and the noise wasn't really good for us. So we have to get back to being able to govern because eventually people are going to realize we're not solving problems. We're just actually causing some of them, or we're relying on a leader who causes problems. And that may be this may be a wake-up call at that point. So that's about the best optimistic spin I could put on it at all. But yeah, this is everything that I've ever learned about comparative politics says to me that we're on shaky foundation right here in terms of our institutional structure in the United States. But that's why getting out and voting is the way to do it. If you like what's going on, get out there and vote. If you don't like what's going on, get out there and vote. But if you don't vote, nobody cares what you think. They do not care. They absolutely will not care. They only care about people who vote. So your opinion is just gone.
And they don't really care about people who vote for third parties either.
Right. They don't really care about people who vote for
Just so
third party.
people know.
Yeah.
The one thing I'd maybe put a slightly optimistic spin on is if Trump wins and our democracy goes to shambles, which those two things are not synonymous, but they correlate better than perhaps a Biden win and democracy going to shambles, is I don't actually know what it says about us as a country, because we are not a country that's run by majority rule on so many things, including how we elect our president. So you need a majority only of the Electoral College. And so you need to get only a plurality of the votes in a few strategic states, while everybody else, half the country, abstains. This time it'll probably only be like 40% or so abstains. And maybe another candidate gets the popular vote. So our students have been alive for probably 5 presidential cycles, and only one of them has the Republican candidate receive the most votes. So Reagan won in '88. None of our students were probably around. Some of them were, but not the majority. '84? No, right. Bush in '88. And since that was the first Bush. Since that, only George W. Bush in 2004 in his reelection bid got a popular vote. And despite that, we've had more Republican presidents than Democratic presidents in that span who have had an impact on so many facets of our institutions. And so I honestly don't know what it says. Maybe I can't be too pessimistic about the American people. If the American people vote for not the person who's currently in office, who has gotten us to the place we're at now. And I don't know if that's a silver lining or not, that people aren't voting. People aren't voting, and that the people who do vote doesn't matter in the sense of the Electoral College, but there is that. And that leads us into, there was one question that somebody left and they wanted to know if we could address it. So the 60 of you that are here, 58 of you that are still with us, thank you. You can hang around if you want to hear this question. But our panelists, if any of you want to further address the Electoral College, I believe that's who posed this question, was about the Electoral College. They want to know, what's the point in voting if the Electoral College can just turn around and vote for the candidate they think is best? Hypothetically, at the end of the day, couldn't the electors just choose who they wanted in office and disregard the voters' voice? So I'll let anybody answer that.
My answer is yes. And I have to go, so goodbye, everyone. That's my answer.
All right. Augie, you had your hand up, and there's been constitutional law cases about this recently, like in the last 2 months on the Supreme Court, I think, about faithless electors and whatnot. So what you got for us?
Yeah, as Ali just mentioned, the court in the term that ended in the early July actually took a look at 2 state laws that require their Electoral College voters to vote per the majority vote within the state. Because what you had in the states of Washington and Colorado were 2 states, or 2 voters, Electoral College voters, who ignored the popular vote wishes of their fellow citizens and voted for other people. I think in Washington it was for Colin Powell, and in Colorado it was for former Ohio Governor John Kasich. And I could be wrong, I could have that backwards, but nevertheless, what the Supreme Court has said is that states can require their Electoral College voters to follow the popular vote will within that state, and it doesn't violate the Constitution. And right now there are at least 30 plus states that have mechanisms that force members of the Electoral College from their state to follow the popular vote outcome within that state. Okay, so the likelihood of what the question posed, at least in a strong majority of the states, cannot happen anymore. And this actually does go against what Alex shared with us earlier in the panel discussion was the original intent of the Electoral College. So it's not all that likely that you're going to see what they call unfaithful electors. All right.
Great. All right. I want to thank all of our panelists and
Michael,
thank
can I-
all of our, yeah, go ahead.
Did Michael get a closing statement? Did I sleep through it? Okay.
Yeah,
I
he
wasn't
did.
sure you
He
did.
spoke.
Okay. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, he did.
Yeah, I did. I got to go. Bye, everyone.
All right.
Bye, Mike.
Thank you to everybody who joined us today. And I sent that link like 3 times in the chat since it kept getting bumped by talk about Antifa. But we hope to see you in a couple weeks. Thank you to Dr. Condit, Dr. Augenbaugh, Dr. Kina, Dr. Newman, Dr. Winterseek, Dr. Parlberg, and Kelsey Russell with the help of VCU Votes. I had a nice time with you all, and I hope you have a very good Wednesday night.
Thanks, Allie.
Thanks.
Thank you, Allie.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. It's nice to have a face to go with your name, Ramona.
Thank you, Dr. Nice to meet you. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time.
Very nice to meet you.
Great panel. I loved it. It was very encouraging. It was outstanding. Great job.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you. Come see us in 2 weeks.
I'm in
Ramona.
Dr. Augie's class. Great job, Dr. Augie.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Ramona. Yeah.
Outstanding. I'm very encouraged. Bye-bye.
Hey, Kelsey, do you want to participate in 2 weeks too? Or did you have a different member of VCU Votes that wanted to participate? Who should I be talking to? Oh, you're on mute.
I can mention it at our next meeting. I'd love to do it, but I'll definitely mention to see if there's anyone else that wants to participate too.
Okay.
October 28th at 7.
Yep. 2 weeks from today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, guys.
Good night. Does anybody else have any questions for any of those of us who are remaining before I end this show?
Signing off, folks.
Signing off too. All right. Good night, Augie. Good night, everyone.